Welcome to the Sinister Side, where dark stories and hidden truths come to light. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. Now, let's uncover the sinister side. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. They first noticed her hands before they noticed her name. In the quarters behind the indigo fields, where sickness moved faster than rumor and death came quietly at night, people began to whisper about a woman whose palms were always warm, even in winter, and whose touch did not hurt. She had arrived years earlier on a ship that brought bodies more than people, her age guessed at by the strength of her back and the calm in her eyes. No one knew where she came from. The trader who sold her said only that she was stubborn and silent. On the plantation she was called many things before she was ever called a witch, mule, girl, shadow, problem. But when a child with a fever that had lasted 6 days stopped shaking after she laid her hand on his head, the whispers began to sharpen into something else. She did not claim to heal. She did not pray aloud or chant in strange tongues. She listened. She watched. She boiled roots and bark she gathered at night, remembering knowledge that had crossed an ocean inside her bones. Sometimes she used nothing at all, only her hands and a patience that felt endless. People came to her quietly at first, slipping into the hut where she slept after work, apologizing for asking, terrified of hope. A woman with a breast swollen and burning from infection cried into her lap while she worked, and by morning the fever had broken. A man whose leg had been crushed under a cart felt pain recede for the first time in months. An overseer's wife, desperate and ashamed, brought her coughing daughter wrapped in a blanket and left silver on the dirt floor like a bribe to God. The child lived. They began to count without meaning to. In a world where numbers were used to measure profit and loss, 33% was not supposed to matter. But it did. 33 people who had been sick enough to be prayed over and prepared for burial were suddenly standing again. 33 people who remembered the heat of her hands, the way she spoke softly, as if to remind the body how to breathe. Some swore they saw light in the room when she worked. Others said time felt strange, stretched thin like cloth about to tear. She never confirmed or denied any of it. When thanked, she lowered her eyes. When accused, she did the same. Gratitude is a fragile thing when it collides with fear. The same mouths that praised her began to close when ministers spoke of false miracles and forbidden knowledge. The plantation owner tolerated her as long as she kept to the quarters and did not draw attention. But attention has a hunger of its own. Word traveled beyond the fields to neighboring farms, to the town where people liked their mysteries solved and their miracles owned by the church. A man who had been healed from a wasting cough stood in the marketplace and told his story too loudly. A preacher asked why God would work through a slave woman instead of a proper servant of the faith. Someone else asked why she healed some and not others. Someone answered, witches always choose. The first accusation came quietly, as these things often do. A cow miscarried. A child fell ill again and died. A woman who had once been healed accused her of jealousy when her husband's attention wandered. None of it was proven. None of it needed to be. Fear does not ask for evidence, only permission. When the constable came to the plantation with a paper bearing a seal, the owner did not argue. He had begun to see her not as an asset, but as a risk. She was taken at dawn, wrists bound, her face expressionless as the quarters watched in silence. No one followed. Everyone remembered the stories of what happened to those who did. The jail was a stone room that smelled of old damp and older despair. They questioned her for hours that turned into days. Where did the power come from? Who taught you? What did you trade for it? She answered simply when she answered at all. From plants, from listening, from God, if God chose to hear her. They laughed at that. God did not work like this, they said. God did not work through her. When she refused to confess to witchcraft, they called it stubbornness. When she did not cry, they called it proof. The trial was held quickly before doubts could grow roots. Witnesses spoke against her and for her, but the ones who mattered had already decided. A man testified that she had healed him and then cursed his dreams. A woman said she saw her talking to shadows. The minister spoke of order and danger, and the need to protect the community from unseen threats. When asked to speak, she stood and looked at the faces watching her die. She said she had helped when she could. She said sickness was not a sin. She said fire would not make truth clearer. The judge did not meet her eyes when he pronounced the sentence. The night they prepared the stake, the air changed. Clouds gathered where the sky had been clear all day, heavy and low. Dogs whined and would not be quiet. Some said it was coincidence. Others crossed themselves and pretended not to notice. They tied her to the post in the square as torches flickered and the crowd pressed close, curiosity mixing with dread. She did not beg. She did not curse them. She closed her eyes as if listening to something only she could hear. Someone shouted that she should confess and save her soul. Someone else shouted for the fire to be lit. What happened next was recorded in fragments, argued over for generations, denied and defended with equal passion. The executioners swore the ropes loosened on their own. A woman in the crowd said the wind blew so hard the torches would not stay lit. A child claimed the ground shook. When the fire finally caught, it burned strangely, low and curling away from her body. Smoke rose thick and white, blinding those closest. People stumbled back, coughing and shouting. When the smoke thinned, the post was blackened and the ropes were ash, but she was gone. There was no body, no blood, no footprints leading away. The guards searched. The square, the alleys, the riverbank. Nothing. Some said she had been rescued by accomplices. Others said the devil had claimed his own. A few, very quietly, said God had intervened after all. The officials closed the case as an escape to avoid panic, but panic does not listen to paperwork. People locked their doors tighter that night. Others left bread and water on their thresholds just in case. In the years that followed, stories grew like ivy. A traveler claimed to see a woman matching her description tending the sick in another town, her hair streaked with grey, her eyes unchanged. A soldier swore his wounds closed overnight after a stranger sat by his bed and hummed. A midwife told of a slave woman who vanished into the woods after helping deliver a child no one thought would live. Each story was dismissed, then repeated, then quietly believed. The number 33 took on a life of its own, appearing in sermons and warnings, in prayers and curses. Historians would later argue about what truly happened, armed with records that contradicted themselves and testimonies shaped by fear. Some concluded she escaped in the chaos, aided by those she had healed. Others insisted the disappearance was exaggerated, that a body had been lost or stolen. But among the people who remembered the warmth of her hands and the calm she brought into rooms heavy with death, there was another belief, one never written down. They believed she was never meant to burn. They believed the world had tried to destroy something it did not understand and failed. Long after the stake rotted away and the square was repaved, mothers still warned their children not to judge what they could not explain. And sometimes when illness struck and hope thinned to nothing, someone would remember the woman with the impossible hands and whisper her story like a prayer, wondering if she was still listening, somewhere beyond fire, beyond chains, beyond fear. By the time the 33rd, healing occurred, the story had already outgrown the woman herself. It no longer belonged to the low huts behind the fields or the quiet nights where pain breathed louder than hope. It moved on its own now, carried by mouths that shaped it differently each time, by fear that sharpened it, by faith that softened it, and by envy that poisoned it. People spoke of her as if she were an idea rather than a person, forgetting that she still woke before dawn, still bent beneath work, still felt hunger and cold and the ache of old scars. The miracles were becoming louder than her footsteps, and that was when everything began to turn. The counting started accidentally. A man named Josiah, who had once served as a clerk before being sold south, kept track of things because numbers calmed him. He noticed patterns where others saw chaos. When the old carpenter survived a wound that had gone black with rot, Josiah murmured that it was the 7th. When the overseer's nephew stopped coughing blood after weeks of prey, nothing else. He said that made 12. No one asked him to stop. Numbers gave shape to wonder, and shape made it feel less frightening. But as the count rose, so did the unease, because numbers also invite judgment. How many is too many before mercy begins to look like rebellion? Each healing had its own story, its own witnesses, its own contradictions. A young woman who had not walked since a fall from a loft claimed she felt heat rush through her legs like water breaking a dam. Her mother swore she heard singing though no one was singing. A field hand with a festering cut said the pain lifted before the poultice even touched his skin. A child with seizures went still in her arms and slept for hours, the first rest he had known. In some cases, she used mixtures she prepared carefully, teaching others how to grind and boil and wait. In others, she did almost nothing, and that frightened people more than any herb could. The number 33 entered the story quietly and then refused to leave. It was a number people already recognized, carried in scripture and whispered in prayers. When Josiah announced it aloud for the first time, the room fell silent. Some crossed themselves, some laughed nervously. Someone said it meant nothing, just coincidence, but coincidence is a thin shield when fear wants a shape. Soon people were saying it had been chosen, that the healing stopped at 33 because something had been completed. Others claimed she refused to help anyone after that, though it was not true. She helped when she could, as she always had. But memory edits without asking permission. As the stories spread beyond the plantation, they changed texture. In nearby farms, she was no longer a quiet woman with warm hands. She was a witch who could pull sickness out like thread. In town, she became a test of faith. Ministers argued from pulpits about false wonders and the danger of trusting signs that did not come through proper channels. Some insisted God could work through anyone, even a slave woman. Others asked why God would choose someone without standing, education, or permission. That question lingered like smoke after a fire, stinging eyes and refusing to clear. People began to watch her more closely. The way she moved through the fields, the way animals did not shy from her, the way she sometimes stood very still, eyes closed, as if listening for something far away. None of it was new, but scrutiny changes meaning. Ordinary things turned suspicious under a fearful gaze. When a storm broke a drought after she tended a dying man, someone said she had called it. When a baby was born healthy against all expectation, someone else said the price would be paid later. Gratitude and dread shared the same breath now, and they did not mix well. The healed themselves became a problem. 33 people who owed their lives, their children, their limbs to someone the law did not recognize as fully human. That debt unsettled the balance Eve, Ryan depended on. A healed man who stood taller and worked harder was praised until someone remembered how he came back from death. Then praise curdled into silence. Some were warned not to speak of it. Others were asked gently at first whether they felt different, whether anything strange lingered. A woman who admitted she dreamed more vividly afterward found herself avoided. A boy who laughed too loudly was said to be mocked. The woman at the center of it all felt the shift before anyone named it. People stopped coming openly. They arrived at night again, frightened and apologetic. Others avoided her entirely, as if her touch might demand something in return. She did not defend herself. She had learned long ago that explanation rarely saves you once a story decides what you are. She kept working, kept listening, kept doing what she could with what she had. But she also began to sense that the air around her was tightening, like skin drawn too close over bone. When the 33rd healing was counted, it was of a man everyone knew would die. He had been brought back from the fields with his breath rattling and his skin grey, laid out while his wife wept and prepared herself for widowhood. She came because there was nothing left to lose. The woman worked through the night, not with urgency but with care, her hands steady even as the man's breathing faltered. By morning, the rattle was gone. By evening, he spoke. By the next day, he asked for food. Words spread before he could even stand. That was the moment when wonder tipped fully into fear. 33 was not just a count now, it was a line. People asked what would happen next. Would the power grow? Would it turn? Would it demand payment? The questions fed on one another until they sounded like answers. Someone remembered an old tale about witches who healed until they decided to harm. Someone else added that such women always vanished or burned. A preacher warned that miracles without obedience were traps. A neighbor pointed out that sickness had not vanished from the world, only shifted. Who was to say where it would land next? The authorities took notice not because of compassion or concern, but because disorder had a scent they recognized. Too many people talking, too many stories crossing boundaries they should not, too much attention on someone who was not supposed to matter. The plantation owner was advised to control the situation. He tried at first by warning her to stop. She did not refuse him outright, but she did not promise either. How could she promise not to help someone in pain? He mistook her calm for defiance, and defiance is intolerable when it comes from those with no power. As scrutiny intensified, contradictions multiplied. One man swore she healed with prayer alone. Another insisted she used dark words. A woman said she had seen symbols scratched into the dirt. Someone else said those marks were just the way she sat, thinking. Truth splintered into versions, each nay, serving the fear or faith of the speaker. The woman herself was rarely quoted, and when she was, her words were reshaped. Silence was taken as guilt, gentleness as deception, strength as threat. The healed began to feel the weight of their survival. Some wished she had let them die, if only to avoid the questions. Others defended her fiercely, risking their own safety to speak. That divided the community further. Gratitude became suspicion, loyalty became danger. People learned to measure their words carefully, to praise God loudly and her quietly, to pretend miracles belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. At night, she dreamed of water and fire, of crossings and endings. She remembered fragments of stories from before the ocean, tales of women who knew how to listen to bodies and land, who were respected until they were feared. She had not chosen this role, but it had chosen her, shaped by need and suffering and chance. She wondered if the number mattered at all, or if it was simply the moment people decided they had seen enough. When the whispers turned to open warning, when children were pulled away from her path and prayers were spoken in her presence as protection rather than gratitude, she understood that the 33 healings had not saved her. Sermons grew sharper, though no names were spoken. Words like temptation, deception, and improper channels echoed beneath the rafters. The woman attended when she was allowed, standing at the back, head bowed. She listened as ministers spoke of miracles belonging to God alone, of humility, of obedience. When they said pride invites punishment, some people glanced in her direction. She did not flinch. She had learned long ago that attention was rarely kind. The first open confrontation came from someone she had helped. A young mother, once grateful beyond words when her child's fever broke, now approached her with fear in her eyes. She asked what had really happened that night, why the fever left so suddenly, whether the woman had spoken to anything unseen. The healer answered gently, explaining again what she had done, what she knew. The mother shook her head unsatisfied, her relief poisoned by dread planted by others. She backed away as if from a flame, clutching her child tighter, whispering a prayer meant as protection. That moment mattered more than any sermon. Gratitude had turned. When help becomes something to fear, the helper becomes dangerous. The plantation owner received letters from neighboring landholders, couched in polite language but heavy with warning. They spoke of unrest, of improper influence, of slaves gathering for reasons other than work or worship. They hinted that allowing such a figure to remain unchecked reflected poorly on his management. He had never liked trouble, and he liked attention even less. To him, the woman was no longer a curiosity or even a useful oddity. She was a liability. He called her to the house one afternoon, an unusual and ominous gesture. She stood before him while he paced, speaking of order, of boundaries, of the need for things to return to how they were. He told her she was to stop helping people, stop gathering plants, stop being spoken about. When she asked quietly how she was meant to refuse the sick, he heard defiance instead of conscience. He told her suffering was not her concern. She lowered her eyes, but she did not promise. Word of that meeting spread, reshaped by fear. By evening, people were saying she had argued, that she had threatened curses, that she believed herself above command. None of it was true, but truth had become irrelevant. What mattered was that the story now had teeth. Soon after, misfortune followed, as misfortune always does, indifferent to human narratives. A child died of an illness she had never been asked to treat. A storm flattened part of a field. A horse broke its leg. These events would have passed without comment before. Now they were stitched together into meaning. People asked why the woman had not saved the child. Others asked whether the storm had been sent. Someone said witches protect their own and punish those who doubt. Someone else replied that doubt itself invites punishment. She became a boundary marker, a way to explain pain without accepti. It's randomness, and once pain has an explanation, it demands a response. Those who defended her found themselves isolated. Josiah, who had once counted the healings, was warned to mind his place. A man who spoke publicly in her favor was whipped for insolence on an unrelated charge. Silence spread like a fever, quicker than any cure. People learned that survival sometimes meant forgetting who had helped you live. The woman felt the narrowing of her world. Paths she had walked freely became watched. The plants she gathered were scrutinized, their names twisted into something sinister. Even her quiet habits were reinterpreted. Her silence became secrecy, her calm became arrogance, her refusal to beg became proof she believed herself untouchable. There was no version of her left that could be understood as harmless. At night, she listened to the sounds of the quarters, the coughs and murmurs, the prayers whispered into darkness. She still helped when she could, but fewer came now, and those who did were frantic, asking her to swear she used no forbidden power, to explain herself in words she did not have. She wanted to tell them that knowledge was not evil, that care was not magic, that fear was the real danger. But fear does not listen, and explanation often sharpens suspicion. The accusations gained form slowly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Someone claimed she had been seen speaking to no one at the edge of the woods. Another said she kept objects hidden beneath her sleeping mat. A child swore her eyes glowed in the dark. These stories contradicted one another, but consistency was never the goal. What mattered was volume. Enough voices speaking at once sound like truth. When the minister finally spoke her name from the pulpit, it felt inevitable rather than shocking. He did not accuse her directly of witchcraft at first. He spoke of vigilance, of rooting out corruption before it spread. He spoke of wolves in humble skins. Everyone understood. By the time he said her name aloud weeks later, the word witch had already settled into place like a verdict waiting to be read. She was summoned again, this time not to explain herself but to be observed. Men questioned her about her past, her knowledge, her intentions. Each answer was weighed not for meaning but for weakness. When she spoke of plants, they asked who taught her. When she spoke of listening to the body, they laughed. When she spoke of God, they accused her of blasphemy. There was no safe answer because safety was not the point. The healed were called to testify informally, questioned in ways meant to confuse and frighten. Some recanted their gratitude. Others claimed they had been afraid to speak before. A few stood by her, voices shaking, insisting she had done nothing wrong. Those voices were noted, remembered, and quietly punished later. Fear learned quickly who to spare and who to mark. She sensed the end approaching long before it arrived, not as a vision or prophecy, but as a simple understanding born of experience. She had seen this shape before, even if the details were new. A woman who does not fit, who does not submit in the expected ways, who cannot be easily categorized, eventually becomes an answer to other people's anxieties, and answers like that are rarely allowed to remain alive. When the accusation was finally made official, it was almost a relief. Suspicion had weight, accusation had form. They named her a witch, a corrupter, a danger to the moral order. They claimed she had deceived the faithful and meddled in matters reserved for God. They said her healings were not mercy, but manipulation. The language was grand and hollow, designed to justify what fear had already decided. She was taken at dawn, not because dawn mattered, but because it was easier. Fewer witnesses, less resistance. Chains closed around her wrists, cold and heavy. As she was led away, some people watched with satisfaction, others with shame, most with relief. Relief that the tension might finally end, that the question might finally be answered, that the danger might finally be contained. She did not resist. Resistance would have confirmed everything they believed. She walked calmly, her steps steady, her face unreadable. In that moment, she was no longer a healer, no longer even a woman in their eyes. She was a symbol onto which fear had been carved, and symbols do not survive once they have served their purpose. Behind her, the quarters fell silent. The place where pain had once gone for relief now held only memory. The accusations had completed their work. Gratitude had fully transformed into terror, and terror, once given permission, had found its target. They kept her in a stone room beneath the courthouse, a place meant less for holding bodies than for stripping them of certainty. The air was damp and smelled of iron and old water. Light entered through a narrow slit high above, turning dust into a slow drifting snowfall. She was given a bench and chains long enough to sit, not enough to stretch. The door closed with a sound that felt final, though nothing had ended yet. The accusation had only begun to work. Interrogation arrived in waves. Men came in pairs or threes, sometimes with papers, sometimes with nothing but their voices. They asked the same questions again and again, reshaping them each time, waiting for her to contradict herself. Where did you learn this? Who taught you? What words did you speak? What did you give in return? They wanted names, rituals, confessions that fit the stories they already believed. When she answered plainly, they frowned as if simplicity itself were a trick. When she refused to embellish, they called it stubbornness. When she stayed calm, they called it arrogance. They brought objects into the room as if props could coax truth from silence. A bundle of dried plants they claimed to have found near her sleeping place. A scrap of cloth marked with dirt they called symbols. A small knife she said for cutting roots, held up as though it were an instrument of sacrifice. Each item was named dangerous before she could speak. She explained what the plants were for, what the marks meant, how the knife was used. They wrote none of that down. Instead, they noted her tone, her lack of fear, the way she did not beg. At night, alone again, she listened to the building breathe. Somewhere above, people moved and talked and laughed. Somewhere below, water dripped steadily, counting time without meaning. She thought of the healed, of their faces at the moment pain released its grip. She wondered how many of them slept easily now, convinced that turning away had kept them safe. She did not blame them. Fear makes cowards of everyone eventually, given enough time. The formal charges were read to her on the third day. They spoke of witchcraft, of false miracles, of consorting with forces forbidden by God and law. They accused her of deceiving the faithful, of undermining order, of spreading unrest. Each word was heavy, chosen not for accuracy but for effect. When asked to respond, she said she had helped people who were suffering. She said she used what knowledge she had. She said sickness was not a moral failing. The clerk paused, uncertain whether to record such an answer. The judge nodded once, and the clerk wrote something else instead. Witnesses were summoned, not all at once, but carefully, to control the story. Some came willingly, eager to align themselves with authority. Others were frightened, dragged into a process they did not understand. The healed were questioned first. They were asked to describe what they felt during their cures, but only in ways that suggested something unnatural. If they spoke of warmth, it was recorded as heat. If they spoke of calm, it was written as trance. If they said she spoke gently, it became chanting. Language bent easily under pressure. A man who owed his life to her was asked whether he felt different afterward. He hesitated, confused, and in that pause they found what they needed. The record would show uncertainty. A woman who insisted nothing strange had occurred was asked why she felt compelled to defend a witch. Her loyalty became suspect, her testimony tainted by alleged influence. Those who praised her openly were dismissed as bewitched themselves, their words folded into the case against her. They brought forward those who had suffered since the healings began, though the timing was arbitrary. A mother whose child had died months later claimed the woman had refused to help, or worse, had chosen not to. A farmer blamed a blight on his land. A preacher spoke of dreams and signs that troubled his sleep. None of this was evidence, but evidence was no longer the goal. They were building a shape that would hold fear securely. She was allowed to speak again near the end, not because they wanted to hear her, but because procedure demanded the appearance of fairness. She stood, chains clinking softly, and looked at the room. She saw some faces she recognized, now careful not to meet her eyes. She spoke slowly, choosing words that felt true even if they would not be believed. She said she had never asked for power. She said she did not command anything beyond her own hands and attention. She said healing was not theft from God but an act of care, and that care did not need permission to exist. Murmurs followed her words, quickly silenced. The judge thanked her and reminded the room that belief did not change law. The verdict was delivered with a calm that suggested it had been written long before. Guilty. The sentence followed without pause. Death by burning, as a warning and a cleansing. The language was precise, almost gentle. It was meant to sound necessary. She was returned to the cell to wait. Time stretched and folded in on itself. Sometimes hours passed without interruption. Other times someone came to stare at her through the bars, curiosity replacing fear now that judgment had been passed. A minister visited once, offering her a chance to confess and save her soul. He spoke kindly, almost sincerely. She asked him whether saving her soul required condemning her life. He did not answer directly. He urged repentance, urged her to name the devil, urged her to accept the mercy offered. She thanked him for his concern and said she had nothing to confess. He left disappointed, shaking his head. News of the sentence spread quickly. Some people felt relief, as though a weight had been lifted. Others felt sickened, but told themselves it was necessary. A few were angry, not at the injustice, but at the discomfort it caused them to feel. The square where the execution would take place was prepared carefully. Wood was stacked. The post was reinforced. Officials rehearsed their roles. Everything was orderly, as if order itself could justify the act. In the days before the burning, strange stories circulated, though no one knew where they started. A guard claimed his keys felt hot when he passed her cell. Another said he dreamed of fire that would not consume. Someone swore the chains rang even when she did not move. These tales were dismissed officially, laughed at loudly, but they unsettled people all the same. Fear, once invited, does not leave easily. She spent her final night awake, not in terror but in reflection. She thought of the ocean crossing she barely remembered, of names lost and faces blurred by time. She thought of the knowledge she carried, older than the accusations, older than the laws that condemned her. She wondered if any of it would survive her. She hoped that somewhere, someone would remember that care had once existed without permission. At dawn, they came for her. The sky was a pale grey, undecided. The air felt heavy, charged with something no one named aloud. They bound her wrists again, more securely this time, and led her through corridors that echoed with footsteps. As she emerged into the square, a crowd had already gathered. Some stood close, eager. Others kept their distance. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Vendors sold bread and drink. Life continued around the edge of death. She was tied to the post with practiced efficiency. The ropes were rough against her skin. She looked out at the faces before her, searching not for mercy but for understanding. She did not find it, but she did not expect to. Someone shouted for her to confess. Someone else shouted for silence. The official read the sentence aloud, his voice steady. When asked for final words, she spoke briefly. She said she wished no harm. She said fear had done more damage than any herb or hand ever could. Her words were swallowed by the crowd. As torches were brought forward, the wind shifted. It came suddenly, sharp and cold, scattering ash and dust. The sky darkened as clouds gathered, low and heavy. People murmured, uneasy, but no one stopped the process. The executioner stepped forward, torch in hand, hesitated for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, then moved closer. The fire had not yet touched the wood. The moment hovered, stretched thin, as if the world itself were holding its breath. And in that suspended instant, before flame and scream and smoke could make the ending official, something changed. Whether it was chance or something else, no one could later agree. But everyone there would remember that feeling. The sense that the story was no longer obeying the script written for it. What followed would be argued over for years. Some would insist nothing extraordinary happened, that panic and confusion exaggerated an ordinary escape. Others would swear they saw the impossible. But all of them, Even those who denied it most fiercely would remember the certainty they felt just before the fire was meant to be lit, the certainty that whatever they believed they were about to destroy did not intend to end there. The moment the fire was supposed to begin stretched longer than anyone expected. The executioner held the torch close to the stacked wood, waiting for a signal that did not come. The official reading the sentence cleared his throat, irritated by the pause, and nodded sharply. That should have been enough. It usually was. Yet the executioner hesitated again, not out of mercy, but because something in the air felt wrong, like stepping forward onto ground that suddenly refused to feel solid. The wind circled the square in erratic bursts, lifting dust and ash into people's eyes. Smoke from the torches bent sideways instead of rising, curling low and thick. Horses tied nearby stamped and pulled against their reins. A dog howled once and was quickly silenced. The woman at the post stood still, her eyes open now, fixed not on the crowd but on the sky above the rooftops, where clouds pressed together as if stitched by invisible hands. Someone in the crowd laughed nervously and said storms came and went all the time. Another crossed himself. The official gestured again, sharper this time, and the executioner finally thrust the torch forward. Flame licked the outer wood, caught, then guttered as the wind surged suddenly, pushing the fire back on itself. Sparks flew, landing harmlessly on damp ground. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not yet fear but confusion. They tried again. This time the fire took, crawling up the dry edges of the stacked logs. Heat bloomed outward, sharp and immediate. The woman did not cry out. She did not struggle. That silence unsettled people more than screaming ever could. Someone shouted for her to confess one last time. Someone else shouted for the fire to be fed. The executioner added more fuel, his movements brisk, professional, as if efficiency could restore control. Then the fire began to behave strangely. Instead of climbing steadily, it curled inward, folding back on itself in slow, rolling waves. The heat intensified, but the flames seemed to avoid her body, bending away as if meeting resistance. Smoke thickened rapidly, white and dense rather than black, stinging eyes and throats. People closest to the post staggered backward, coughing. The crowd surged unevenly, pressing forward in some places, retreating in others. Shouts overlapped, arguments breaking out as no one could see clearly. Through the smoke, the post remained visible, blackening and cracking. The ropes burned quickly, snapping with sharp, dry sounds. Several witnesses would later insist they saw the woman still standing there, unbound, untouched by flame. Others swore they could not see her at all, that the smoke swallowed everything. Memory fractured in that moment, splintering into versions that would never fully align again. The wind rose abruptly, not a steady gust but a violent rush that tore through the square, knocking hats loose, extinguishing torches, scattering embers. The fire flared once more and then collapsed in on itself, leaving behind a smouldering ring of charred wood. The smoke billowed upward all at once, thick and blinding, then began to thin just as quickly, drawn away by the wind. When visibility returned, the post stood alone. The ropes were gone, reduced to ash. The wood was burned and blackened where the fire had touched it. But the woman was not there. No body slumped against the post. No remains at its base. Nothing but scorched ground and the stunned silence of hundreds of people trying to understand what they were seeing. For several heartbeats no one moved. Then the square erupted. People shouted that she had escaped. Others screamed that the devil had taken her. Someone fell to their knees, sobbing, convinced they had witnessed a miracle. The officials barked orders, demanding calm, ordering guards to search immediately. The executioner stared at the empty space where a body should have been, his face drained of color, his hands trembling despite himself. They searched everywhere. Guards pushed through the crowd, overturning carts, peering into alleys and doorways. Men were sent to the riverbank, to the roads leading out of town, to the edge of the woods. They circled the square repeatedly, checking beneath the platform, behind buildings, anywhere a person might hide. There were no footprints leading away, no sign of struggle, no blood, no discarded chains. It was as if she had been lifted straight out of the world between one breath and the next. The official in charge declared it an escape within minutes, his voice loud and insistent, as though volume alone could make it true. He accused the crowd of panic, blamed the smoke, the wind, the confusion. He suggested accomplices, distractions, hidden passages. His words sounded rehearsed even to his own ears. The explanation was necessary because the alternative was unthinkable, but panic does not disappear because it is ordered to. People argued loudly, recounting what they had seen. Some insisted she vanished in plain sight, that one moment she stood bound, the next she was simply gone. Others claimed the smoke had concealed a rescue, though no one could say who carried her away or how. A few swore the flames themselves bent aside, refusing to touch her. These voices were shouted down, mocked, threatened into silence. Officials reminded everyone of the danger of spreading hysteria. By nightfall, the square had been cleared, scrubbed of ash and debris. Guards remained posted, not to protect the space, but to control the story. Anyone lingering too long was told to go home. Anyone asking questions was warned sharply. The event was officially recorded as a failed execution due to interference and escape. The record did not mention the fire's behavior, the wind, or the absence of any trace. Paper accepted lies more easily than people did. That night, the town did not sleep. Doors were barred more carefully than usual. Candles burned low in windows as people whispered behind them, replaying the scene again and again, each telling sharpening or softening the edges to suit their fear. Some prayed in earnest, asking forgiveness for what they had witnessed. Others prayed for protection, convinced something unnatural now moved freely among them. A few, very quietly, felt something close to relief, though they did not dare name it. The guards tasked with searching through the night returned empty-handed. At the river, the water moved calmly, offering no sign of disturbance. In the woods, nothing appeared broken or trampled. No one reported seeing a woman fleeing, injured or otherwise. By morning, exhaustion replaced urgency, and explanations hardened into official truth. She had escaped with help, vanished into the countryside, and would likely die alone or be captured elsewhere. Yet small details refused to align. A guard admitted, under his breath, that the chains had felt hot before the fire even reached them. Another said the smoke smelled wrong, not like burning wood or flesh, but sharp and clean, like rain after heat. A woman who had stood near the front swore she heard humming beneath the roar of the fire, low and steady, though she could not place the sound. Each detail was dismissed individually, but together they formed a question no one could comfortably answer. In the following days, the authorities worked hard to reassert control. The incident was framed as a cautionary tale about disorder, about the danger of rumor and unchecked influence. The woman's name was discouraged from being spoken. Guards were posted more visibly. Sermons focused on obedience and humility. Fear was redirected outward, away from doubt and towards silence. But the damage was done. The image of the empty post lodged itself in people's minds, impossible to erase. Children reenacted the scene in whispers, arguing over whether she had flown or been carried away by angels or demons. The healed, those who had once counted themselves among the 33, felt a complicated mix of guilt and awe. Some took the disappearance as proof they had been right to fear her, others took it as proof they had been wrong to abandon her. As for the woman herself, she became something less and more than human in the telling. No longer merely a healer, no longer merely a slave accused of witchcraft, she transformed into absence, into possibility. The fact that no one could say with certainty what happened to her became the most powerful part of the story. Certainty had failed. Control had failed. Fire, the final answer meant to erase her, had not completed its task. Long after officials insisted the matter was settled, people would remember the way the flames curled back, the way the smoke blinded and then cleared, the way the space beside the post felt suddenly wrong, as if something essential had been removed. Some would argue for the rest of their lives that nothing impossible occurred, that fear and confusion created a shared illusion. Others would argue just as fiercely that they had witnessed something beyond explanation. But no one who stood in that square could forget the moment when the fire was meant to end the story, and instead the story refused to end at all. In the days that followed the disappearance, the town behaved like a body that had survived a sudden shock. Movement returned first, then sound, then something like routine, but beneath it all ran a deep, persistent tremor. People went back to work, to church, to meals taken at familiar tables, yet every action felt provisional, as though reality itself might shift again without warning. The authorities insisted the matter was closed. The woman had escaped. The danger had passed. Order had been restored. Repetition was meant to turn these statements into truth. It did not work. Questions lingered in the corners of conversations, in the pauses before sleep, in the way people glanced toward the square and then away again. The post was removed quickly, the charred ground scraped clean, but absence can be more conspicuous than any monument. Children asked where the witch had gone and were told sharply not to. Ask such things. Adults told themselves the same thing with less success. The first reported sighting came less than a week later. A farmer returning late from the fields claimed he saw a woman standing at the edge of his land, just beyond the fence line, her figure half lit by moonlight. He called out thinking she might be lost or injured. She did not answer. When he took a step closer, she moved back into the shadows and vanished among the trees. He told his wife, who told a neighbor, who told the story with embellishments by morning. By afternoon, officials had labeled it drunken imagination. Then a child who had once been healed of seizures woke screaming in the night, insisting the woman had sat by his bed and told him not to be afraid. His parents, pale and shaken, insisted the door had been locked from the inside. The child slept peacefully afterward for the first time in months. When questioned, he described her hands as warm, just as they remembered. The parents were warned not to spread dangerous fantasies. A midwife traveling between settlements spoke of meeting a woman on the road who helped her deliver a child when complications arose unexpectedly. The stranger worked quickly and calmly, then left without giving her name. When the midwife described her later, the details matched too closely to dismiss easily. Still, the story was folded into rumor, treated as coincidence layered with fear. Officials responded the only way they knew how, by tightening control. Curfews were enforced more strictly, gatherings were discouraged, guards were instructed to question anyone traveling alone, especially women. Sermons grew sterner, reminding congregations that the devil delighted in confusion and false hope. The more they spoke, the more the stories multiplied, slipping through cracks in the official narrative like water through fingers. The healed found themselves under renewed scrutiny. Some were questioned again, asked whether they felt different since the disappearance, whether they experienced dreams, sensations, urges they could not explain. Most denied everything, understanding now that survival depended on silence. A few could not bring themselves to lie. They spoke of dreams of water and fire, of a voice humming softly, of waking with a sense of calm that felt undeserved. These admissions were carefully noted and quietly used to justify further warnings. Josiah, who had once counted the healings, began writing again, though not numbers this time. He recorded accounts he heard, dates, names, small details others overlooked. He did it privately, knowing that written memory could be as dangerous as spoken truth. He did not try to decide what was real. He only wrote what people said, trusting that meaning might emerge later. He noticed how often the stories shared certain elements: warmth, calm, sudden relief, disappearance without trace. He noticed how often fear followed relief, like a shadow. Outside the town, the stories traveled far, stir and changed more freely. In some versions, the woman had walked through the fire untouched, stepping calmly away as the crowd screamed. In others, the fire itself had bowed, extinguishing in her presence. Some said angels had descended. Others insisted darker forces were at work. Each retelling revealed more about the teller than the event. Faith and fear reshaped her image endlessly. Those who claimed to see her often described her as older now, her hair streaked with grey, her movements slower but surer. Others said she looked exactly the same, unchanged by time or flame. One man swore she had no shadow. Another said her shadow moved before she did. Contradictions piled up, but no one could fully dismiss them. Too many accounts came from people who had nothing to gain by lying. The authorities attempted to locate her more aggressively, dispatching patrols into nearby woods and settlements. They found nothing. No trail, no accomplices, no evidence of a wounded fugitive struggling to survive. The absence of proof began to undermine their certainty. Each failed search made the official explanation feel thinner, more strained. Meanwhile, sickness did not disappear from the world. It never does. But when illness struck, people hesitated before seeking help from traditional sources. Some prayed harder, others waited longer. A few whispered the woman's name under their breath, not as a summons, but as a hope, and sometimes, inexplicably, recovery followed. Whether these recoveries were natural or something else, no one could say. But the timing unsettled those who wanted the story finished. One winter night, a guard fell ill suddenly, feverish and shaking. He had been one of those posted near the square after the disappearance, one of those who laughed loudest at talk of miracles. His condition worsened rapidly. A woman who had once been healed came to his bedside despite warnings. She sat with him, holding his hand, humming softly. By morning, his fever had broken. He told no one what he dreamed that night, but he stopped laughing. Fear shifted again, turning inward. What if the woman returned not as a threat, but as a witness? What if she remembered faces? What if survival did not mean safety? People began to examine their own actions during the trial, the execution, the aftermath. Regret surfaced in quiet moments, unwelcome and sharp. It was easier to believe she was something other than human than to accept what had been done to her. Church attendance swelled briefly, then fractured. Some ministers softened their tone, speaking cautiously of mercy and humility. Others doubled down, warning that lingering fascination was itself a temptation. Congregations split along invisible lines, defined not by doctrine, but by how people spoke, or did not speak, of the woman who vanished. Children continued to dream of her. Unlike adults, they spoke openly, describing a woman who stood at the edge of fire, who touched their heads and told them stories with UT words. Parents scolded them, frightened by the persistence of these dreams. Some children stopped talking, others did not. Years passed, but the story did not fade as expected. Instead, it settled into the town's foundation, a layer beneath daily life. Newcomers heard fragments and asked questions. Old residents answered carefully, shaping the tale to sound less dangerous, less unresolved. Still, certain details always slipped through: the empty post, the unburned body, the certainty that something had gone wrong with the ending. Historians would later argue that mass hysteria explained everything, that smoke, fear, and expectation combined to create a shared illusion. They pointed to similar cases, to the unreliability of memory. They wrote confidently, citing records that supported their conclusions. What they could not explain was why the story persisted even among those who rejected it, why denial did not erase unease. Those who believed she lived spoke of her not as a ghost or a demon, but as a woman who had stepped out of one kind of bondage into another kind of freedom. They imagined her moving quietly from place to place, helping when she could, vanishing before gratitude turned again to fear. They believed she learned from what had been done to her, that she stayed only long enough to heal and never long enough to be counted again. Others believed she had become something else entirely, transformed by fire that refused to consume her. They spoke of her in warnings, telling children to behave, to respect forces they did not understand. These stories carried her name like a threat rather than a comfort. The truth, whatever it was, remained out of reach, and perhaps that was its power. The inability to close the story forced people to live with uncertainty, to acknowledge that control was never as complete as they wanted to believe. The woman who healed 33 people and vanished at the stake became a reminder that fear can destroy what it does not understand, but it cannot always erase it. Some nights, when the wind moved just right and smoke from hearth fires drifted low, people remembered the way the flames had curled back on themselves, the way the square had gone silent. They remembered the space beside the post where a body should have been and was not. And in that remembering, the mystery stayed alive, not demanding belief, only refusing to be forgotten. As time wore on, the story stopped behaving like a single event and began to live as many lives at once. It lived in memory, in rumor, in warning, and in longing. It lived differently depending on who carried it. For those who had demanded the fire, it became something to bury beneath explanation. For those who had remained silent, it became a quiet ache. For those who had been healed, it became a weight they carried everywhere, light enough to ignore most days, heavy enough to bend them on others. The square itself changed. New stones were laid, stalls were built and rebuilt. Children played where the post had once stood, unaware at first, then vaguely aware, then told not to ask. Life pressed forward the way it always does, but the ground remembered. On certain evenings, when the light fell at an angle that sharpened shadows, people felt an inexplicable unease there, as if the air held a memory it refused to release. The authorities aged, retired, died. New men took their places, inheriting records stripped of discomfort and heavy with certainty. On paper, the case was closed cleanly. A dangerous woman had escaped justice. Vigilance had been restored. Order had prevailed. The past, properly arranged, posed no threat. Yet even those who believed the record sensed its fragility. They spoke of the event carefully, as one speaks of a wound that healed badly, tender beneath the skin. The healed did not form a group, not openly. There were no meetings, no shared symbols. That would have drawn attention. Instead, they recognized one another through small signs. A hesitation when the story was mentioned. A shared look when someone laughed too loudly at the idea of miracles. A subtle refusal to condemn. They lived ordinary lives as best they could, but each carried a private reckoning. Survival had come at a cost they could not name without risk. Some tried to repay the debt in quiet ways. A woman who had once been healed began tending the sick herself, careful never to let anyone call it anything but kindness. A man taught his children to listen to the body, to respect pain without fearing it. Others did nothing at all, choosing distance over memory. None of these choices brought full peace. The sightings continued, sporadic and uneven. Years might pass without a single report, then 3 would surface within a month. A healer matching her description was said to appear after a flood, helping the injured before disappearing when officials arrived. A woman was seen near a plantation far from the town, freeing a trapped child and vanishing into the cane fields. A dying man claimed she sat with him through the night, holding his hand until morning came. Each story was dismissed, then repeated, then half believed. Over time, the details shifted again. In later tellings, she no longer spoke at all. She communicated through touch, through presence. Her face was harder to describe, her age uncertain. Some said she left behind small signs, herbs placed carefully, water warmed and waiting. Others said she left nothing but relief. What remained constant was the ending of each account. She was always gone before thanks could harden into attention. Children who grew up hearing fragments of the story absorbed it differently than their parents had. To them, she was not primarily a witch or a criminal. She was a figure who moved between danger and care, who did what adults failed to do. Some children feared her, others admired her. A few, especially those who felt unseen, imagined her as someone who might appear when no one else would. One boy, born long after the fire, became obsessed with the number 33. He counted steps, breaths, stars. He said the number felt like a door. His parents scolded him, uneasy without knowing why. Years later, he would leave the town and write about it, stripping the story down to what could be supported by documents. Even then, something resisted his effort. The absence at the center of the story refused to become solid. Travelers carried the tale outward, reshaping it as they went. In some regions, she became a saintly figure, a martyr spared by divine intervention. In others, she was a cautionary figure, proof that forbidden knowledge never truly dies. In still others, she was simply a mystery, a story told late at night when the world feels thinner and more open to doubt. Each version said more about the listeners than about her. Those who insisted she had escaped by ordinary means clung to practicality. They imagined hidden passages, distractions, accomplices whose names had been lost. This explanation comforted them because it preserved the world as predictable. Fire burns, chains bind, people die when condemned. To accept anything else felt like surrendering the rules that kept fear manageable. Yet, even among the skeptics, the image of the empty post lingered. They could explain smoke, they could explain panic, they could not explain why certainty had vanished with her. Something had slipped through the machinery designed to end her, and that failure haunted even those who denied it. As decades passed, the town told the story less often, but with greater care. Names were softened, dates blurred. The brutality of the accusation faded, replaced by vaguer language about troubled times. Still, the core remained. A woman had healed. She had been condemned. She had vanished. No retelling ever managed to erase one of those elements without weakening the whole. Some nights, elders spoke of her when drink loosened their tongues. They admitted fear had guided them more than faith. They admitted relief at being spared the responsibility of deciding differently. These confessions rarely survived the morning. Daylight restored discipline. Regret was easier to carry quietly. The land itself seemed to remember her differently. Plants she once gathered continued to grow stubbornly in places they should not have thrived. People argued about whether she had cultivated them or whether they had always been there. Farmers noticed that soil near the old square was unusually fertile, though no one could explain why. Such observations were shrugged off, then remembered later, added to the pile of small, inconvenient details. The idea that she might still be alive grew harder to dismiss as years passed. If she had escaped injured and alone, she should have been caught or died. If she had been taken by some force, why did stories of healing persist? Each explanation answered one question and raised another. The mystery resisted containment, refusing to re-sow into comfort. Those who believed she lived spoke of her not as powerful, but as careful. They imagined her choosing obscurity as protection, refusing again to be counted. They believed the number 33 marked not an ending, but a lesson learned at terrible cost. Healing without permission had drawn fire. Healing unseen might endure. Others believed she had become something that could not be named without fear. They warned children not to wander, not to trust strangers, not to seek answers that challenged order. These warnings carried her shadow forward, turning memory into discipline. The truth may have been simpler or stranger than anyone imagined. It may have involved courage, chance, and the fragile unpredictability of crowds and weather. It may have involved something beyond explanation. The world did not provide a final answer, and in doing so, it forced those who remembered to live with ambiguity. What endured was not certainty, but impact. The story changed how people thought about power, about who was allowed to heal and who was punished for it. It lingered in questions asked quietly and decisions made differently. It unsettled easy divisions between faith and fear, obedience and care. Long after the last person who witnessed the fire was gone, the story still stirred discomfort. It reminded listeners that justice could fail spectacularly, that systems designed to destroy could misfire, that fear could not always finish what it started. It suggested that something essential might survive even the most determined attempt to erase it. And somewhere beyond records and sermons and warnings, the woman herself remained undefined. Not a symbol she chose, not a legend she sought, but a presence shaped by others' need to explain what they could not undo. Whether she walked the world still or had passed into story entirely, she continued to trouble the boundaries between what people believed possible and what they had witnessed with their own eyes. By the time the story reached its furthest edges, it no longer belonged to any one place. It had slipped free of the town that tried to destroy it, free of the records that tried to tame it, free even of the fear that first gave it shape. It existed now in the way certain truths do, carried quietly, altered by distance, but stubbornly alive. The woman at its center had become less visible with time, not because she had been forgotten, but because she had been absorbed into something larger than memory. Those who lived longest with the knowledge of what had happened eventually understood that the mystery was not only about her disappearance, it was about what remained afterward. The town never burned another accused witch, though no law forbade it, no official announcement was made, no sermon claimed a lesson learned. And yet when fear rose again, as it always does, something held it back. People remembered the empty post, They remembered how certainty had cracked. Even those who denied believing, the story felt its restraint on their hands. In later generations, healers emerged quietly, careful never to gather attention. Some learned from books. Others learned from observation, from listening to bodies and land the way the woman once had. None of them claimed miracles. None of them allowed themselves to be counted. When asked how they knew what to do, they gave vague answers and changed the subject. They understood, instinctively or by inheritance, that survival required invisibility. The number 33 faded from sermons and warnings, but it did not disappear entirely. It appeared unexpectedly in diaries, in margins of letters, in private tallies never explained. Some said it was coincidence, others believed it marked the boundary where wonder becomes danger, a few believed it represented lives that had crossed a threshold and could never fully return. No single meaning survived intact, but the number endured, like a scar whose origin is forgotten, but whose presence is unquestioned. Travelers who carried the story farthest often stripped it of its harshest edges. In their telling, the woman was gentler, the crowd less cruel, the fire more symbolic than real. This softened version made the story easier to hear, easier to believe. But among those closest to the truth, the violence remained essential. To forget the cruelty was to misunderstand the cost. The mystery did not exist despite fear and injustice, it existed because of them. A few scholars attempted to solve the case definitively. They gathered testimonies, compared dates, reconstructed weather patterns. They proposed theories involving distraction, panic, hidden passageways. Their work was thorough, convincing even. And yet, when asked whether they themselves believed the mystery was solved, they hesitated. Something always remained unaccounted for, some detail too neat, some silence too heavy. The absence at the center of the story resisted closure, no matter how carefully it was framed. Those who believed she had lived on spoke of her differently as time passed. Early accounts described flight and urgency. Later ones spoke of patience. She was imagined as moving slowly, deliberately, choosing moments rather than fleeing danger. She became a figure of restraint, someone who understood that the world did not need to see her to feel her effects. In this version, survival was not escape but adaptation. Others believed she had died that day, not by fire but by transformation. They argued that the woman could not have remained unchanged after such an event. Something had ended, something else begun. Whether that something was spiritual, symbolic, or psychological depended on who told the story. In these tellings, she did not vanish so much as dissolve into memory, leaving behind a trace that altered how people behaved long after her physical presence was gone. Among the descendants of those who had stood in the square, the story took on a more personal weight. Family histories contained gaps and hesitations. Names were omitted, roles were softened. Some ancestors were described as having been elsewhere that day, despite evidence to the contrary. Silence was passed down like an heirloom. Children sensed there were questions they were not supposed to ask. Some asked them anyway. One such child, years later, stood in the rebuilt square and felt an inexplicable sadness. Nothing marked the place, no plaque, no stone. Yet the feeling persisted, heavy and quiet. The child asked an elder what had happened there. The answer came slowly, carefully, stripped of accusation but not of truth. A woman had been condemned. She had healed people. She had disappeared. The child asked why. The elder said because people were afraid. That answer lingered longer than any detail of fire or smoke. Fear, in the end, was the most enduring character in the story. It had shaped the accusations, fueled the fire, distorted memory, and attempted to finish what it began. Yet fear had failed in one crucial way. It had not erased the woman. Instead, it had ensured she would be remembered, questioned, and reconsidered. In trying to destroy what it did not understand, fear had exposed its own limits. The story did not inspire open rebellion or sweeping reform. Its influence was quieter, more insidious. It lived in hesitation, in moments when someone chose restraint over accusation, curiosity over condemnation. It lived in the discomfort people felt when faced with unexplained kindness. It lived in the knowledge that certainty can be more dangerous than doubt. As centuries passed, the woman's name, whatever it had been, dissolved completely. This loss troubled some historians, who saw it as an injustice layered atop another. Others argued that anonymity protected her, freeing the story from being reduced to biography. Without a name, she could not be contained. She remained possibility rather than property. In some tellings, she was said to appear at times of great suffering, never staying long, never accepting thanks. In others, she was said to be gone forever, leaving only a warning etched into collective memory. Both versions coexisted without cancelling each other out. The story did not require agreement to survive. What endured most strongly was the question her disappearance left behind. Not how she vanished, but why she had been condemned in the first place. That question proved harder to silence. It forced listeners to examine the boundaries they drew between acceptable and unacceptable care, between sanctioned power and forbidden compassion. It asked who is allowed to heal and at what cost. The fire, meant to close the matter, had instead opened something that could not be easily sealed. It had revealed the fragility of authority, the unreliability of judgment made under fear, the resilience of stories rooted in injustice. The empty space where a body should have been became a mirror, reflecting the violence of certainty back at those who demand. It. In the end, the mystery did not offer resolution. It offered persistence. The woman who healed 33 people, who was condemned, who vanished, did not return to demand belief or vengeance. She returned only as memory and question, refusing to settle into comfort. The story asked to be carried, not solved. And so it continued, passed quietly from one generation to the next, not as a legend meant to impress, but as a reminder meant to unsettle. It reminded people that care can be dangerous in a world built on control, that fear can masquerade as righteousness, and that even the most final punishments can fail to erase what truly matters. Somewhere beyond fire and record and explanation, the woman remained unresolved, not burning, not silenced, not finished. The mystery endured not because it defied reason, but because it exposed something deeper than reason alone could mend. And in that endurance, the story found its true ending, one that did not close, but stayed open, waiting for each listener to decide what it meant to them. In that way, the mystery did not belong to the past. It lived on, not demanding belief, not offering proof, but insisting on one quiet truth, that the fire meant to end her had failed to close the story, and that failure would echo longer than the flames ever could,